Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this flash panel. The title is Divided States of America, Sedition, the Inauguration, and the Unfolding Crisis in American Democracy. And we are so glad that you could join us today. I'm Amy Koehlinger, an Associate Professor of North American Religious History in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion at Oregon State University. Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon is located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River or Ampanefu Band of Kalapuya. Following the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, the Kalapuya people were forcibly removed to reservations in Western Oregon. Today, living descendants of these people are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. The School of History, Philosophy, and Religion created flash panels like this one as a way to provide students and the general community with information and analysis about current events and important national developments. Our goal is to provide essential, expert, nonpartisan analysis of some of the most pressing issues in the world today to our students and our community. We've held flash panels on the occupation of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, on changes to US immigration policies, on the mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue, and on the first impeachment of Donald Trump, to name a few. These are tense times. As faculty in the liberal arts, we absolutely believe that people of good faith can discuss sensitive issues calmly and rationally. Indeed, for the health of our democracy, it is essential that we discuss difficult topics, that we apply the insights of experts to complex issues, and that we keep respect for each other in the forefront of our interactions. This is also, I believe, a critical moment in American democracy. The very real ongoing threat of violence underscores that democracy is fragile and an incomplete achievement at best. Conversations like these and reality-based information and analysis are important antidotes to the threat that campaigns of intentional disinformation pose to our civic health. I'm grateful to this panel of experts who volunteered to share their insights with us today. They represent the academic fields of history, philosophy, and political science and religious studies at Oregon State University, the University of Oregon, and Virginia Tech. And I will introduce each panelist before their presentation. Panelists will offer 10 minutes or so of commentary, and then we will have time for people to pose questions to them. If you have a question you would like to ask, please write it in the chat for me to share with panelists. Finally, I would like to thank those who have made this panel possible. Thank you to Nicole von Germeten, the Director of the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion, Larry Rogers, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, and Aaron Sneller and Natalia Bueno for support and assistance. And now to our panel. Our first panelist, Allison Gash, is an associate professor of political science at the University of Oregon. Dr. Gash's research focuses on intersections of law and social policy, with a specific interest in race, gender, sexuality, and disability in the context of housing and family.
Thank you, Amy, and thanks Oregon State for putting this together, and for Amy for really organizing this, and those of you out in the universe, thanks so much for joining us tonight and for remaining invested in these conversations around democracy, because I think the more we have these conversations, the better off we are. So there's so much to talk about. In a way, it was really hard to figure out what specific thing I wanted to focus on, because my brain is having this intense ADHD moment over the craziness of our political world. What I want to really focus on today in my talk or in my comments are voting rights. Obviously, the topic of voting is a really big one. Obviously, what's prompted much of the weeks following the election, much of the chaos prompting the weeks following the election was about this question of voting. Was this narrative about fraudulent voting, was this misinformation and what's now called the big lie about voter fraud. But that doesn't mean the fact that that this was a big lie doesn't mean that voting rights isn't a really big issue, and certainly should be an issue that is high on the agenda of the Biden administration. And that is because although there was this lie perpetuated around voter fraud, this idea that there were certain states, certain communities engaging in some attempt to actually get rid of votes that had been valid or somehow fraudulently engage in double voting. The fact is that although those things didn't take place, there were absolutely instances of voter disenfranchisement, and that those problems have been ongoing. And one of the things that the Biden administration will need to address is a case called Shelby County versus Holder that took place, was decided in 2013. What this particular case does is it actually removes a really important element of the federal government's capacity to monitor laws that are being established that disenfranchise certain communities, in particular communities of color, from being able to engage in their right to vote. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was created specifically to deal with questions of continued racial disenfranchisement in the context of voting. It was a response to the massive efforts to disenfranchise Black voters in the context of the South, and was ultimately enacted to make sure that there were standards in place so that not just Southern states, but all states could make sure that different communities were able to vote in the way that there was their constitutional right to do so. One of the elements of this particular act was that the federal government would have extraordinary oversight, in particular oversight over particular counties and states that had had either high populations of unregistered Black voters or states that had had a history of disenfranchising voters in other ways. And so one of the things that the federal government would do was that they would ask for, when there was any change being made in these particular counties or these particular states, when there's any change being made, whether that was a change to the shapes of districts, whether that was a change to particular voting laws that were being implemented, they would have to go through a process of what's called pre-clearance, meaning they would need to get sometimes a federal judge or sometimes a federal agency to basically evaluate those laws and those strategies and then approve of them. But what happens in Shelby County versus Holder in 2013 is that the Supreme Court essentially rules unconstitutional, not the pre-clearance standard, but the section of the Voting Rights Act that actually tells us who those counties and states are. So there's a formula that goes into establishing which counties and which states need to submit to pre-clearance, which essentially gutted the Voting Rights Act because, of course, Congress couldn't get together to figure out which states were going to be on that list anymore. And this is what invites a whole rash of state policies that have further disenfranchised Black voters, further disenfranchised the votes of communities of color, that really shaped a lot of what was happening both in the 2016 election and then again in the 2020 election. So the Biden administration now has this really small but golden opportunity in having access not just to the presidency, but also to the House and the Senate to pass laws that will fix the problem that was created in Shelby County versus Holder, to at the very least deal with this problem of Section 4, to repopulate Section 4 with a set of counties and a set of states that will be beholden to this evaluative process, so we can make sure that further disenfranchising pieces of legislation and acts are not created. But I think that this moment, right, this moment around first these false allegations of voter fraud, but then these very real instances, continued instances of voter disenfranchisement in the form of closing polling stations, in the form of voter ID laws, in the form of really trying to discredit entire modes of voting simply because they are popular among certain communities. Modes of disenfranchisement that are really centered on redistricting communities so that Black voters cannot really able to exercise their vote because they become minorities in their own, right, numerical minorities in their own counties, right? All of these things are things that are actual instances of voter disenfranchisement, are things that actually degrade democracy. And these are things that the Biden administration has to address in the coming weeks, in the coming months, simply because there is a great need, but also there is a great opportunity.
Thank you so much, Allison. Our next panelist is Sylvester A. Johnson. He is a professor in the Department of Religion and Culture and the founding director of the Virginia Tech Center for Humanities. Dr. Johnson also is Assistant Vice Provost for the Humanities at Virginia Tech and Executive Director of the university's Tech for Humanity initiative. Dr. Johnson specializes in the study of technology, race, religion, and national security. So it's very good to have you here.
Thanks very much, Professor Koehlinger, for the invitation. Really excited to join the panelists, and thank you for organizing a conversation on such an important issue of great concern. I think it is very striking that we've just had historic Inauguration Day that was for so many people, not just in the US, but globally, something that occurred with a sigh of relief, because for the first time in a long time, there was actual uncertainty about whether there would actually be a transition to a new administration. And that if there were a transition, that it would, it's a question of whether it would be a peaceful one or one that was filled with violence. And I think if you had asked just about anyone a few years ago if that situation would prevail, people may have just laughed, because every change of administration is largely a non-event. And then we see people ballroom dancing on TV, but for the most part, people are just kind of going about their day unless you're actually at the parties that are going on in DC. But this time there was real anxiety and a lot of questions about whether or not we would actually have functioning of what are considered very basic elements of democratic process and the transition to another administration. And I think one of the things that becomes important for us to consider is both the short-term and long-term consequences of what Professor Gash was just talking about, with the effort to prevent and to disrupt a very central part of the democratic process around the voting. And this extends more broadly to efforts to really produce a very high stakes engagement with the question of whether the country was being taken over by an illegitimate administration, and whether the rule of the people had been wrested away from those to whom it rightly belonged, that an election had been stolen. This was the claim that was made, a false claim that was made, but nevertheless, a claim that has garnered broad support and that has been repeated and continues to be repeated, actually, by very high level people who are in US Congress, who claim that there still need to be investigations of whether or not there was a rightful process that produced an outcome of the election. One of the things I think that is important for us to consider is whether we will have to contend with the politicization of these rivalries in a way that are calling into question the status of many people in this country, including the new administration, as enemies of the US, as people who are outside the political community. And there are a couple of points I think that I'll quickly mention to bear in mind. One is the significance of the armed white militia movements that have been ongoing for decades. One that I think is exemplary, the Oath Keepers, that was founded in 2009 by Stuart Rhodes, who has actually been very successful in galvanizing many thousands of people across the US to fulfill the oath that's referred to in the name of that organization, is to defend the US Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic. That oath is sworn by members of the military and by police departments. It's a very enlightening article in the Atlantic Monthly from November of 2020 that was pointing out that leaked database of the membership of the Oath Keepers that was obtained by the Atlantic Monthly indicated about 2/3 of the members of Oath Keepers had a background in the US military or in law enforcement, and around 10% of those were active duty. Now, if you consider the events of the attempted insurrection, the attempted siege of the US Capitol and Congress that occurred this month earlier, one of the things that is striking is the level of participation in that process, or even sympathy that was happening with those who were tasked with defending members of the highest level of government and defending the Capitol. There were massive failures to heed very clear warnings, and thanks to social media, fairly obvious planning that was going on for those incidents that were attempts to capture, detain members of Congress, and even to kill members of Congress. There were lots of plans to kill them. There were calls for their deaths. And what we saw was just a massive failure to offer protection. At one point, the vice president of the United States was running for his life, being escorted out of the chambers of the Capitol, and the chain of succession of the vice president at the time, Mike Pence, and the Charles Grassley and Nancy Pelosi were there, had 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 of those people been injured or killed or abducted. There could not have continued, it seemed, the counting of the Electoral College votes. Like, what would have happened, and who would have been in their place? It would have been massive disruption to our process. But more broadly than that is what this says about the capacity for armed racist militias to operate with such a high level of participation from military personnel and law enforcement personnel who are actually tasked with protecting and securing national interests in the state. And so the second thing I'll quickly point to before I close is one of the works that I find to be both problematic and insightful by Michel Foucault. And this is his published lectures, Il faut défendre la société, that society must be defended, that were published posthumously as a book, in which he tries to explain the rise of race. And very characteristic of his style, Foucault was very Eurocentric in his attention toward explaining issues. He purposely did not write about non-European peoples under siege of colonialism. He focused on Europe and applied what he called an analysis of internal colonialism. But this actually ends up being useful and insightful because it is an account of race that is, because it focuses on only Europeans, it begins explicitly with people who are not racialized. And so he actually tries to explain, and he has explained how you get race with people who are especially not even seen as being raced. And one of the things that he points to is the development of this idea of people who, although they all live in the same society, some come to be seen as enemies of that society who must be fought against and from whom that society must be defended, even though they're actually the people of the society. And given this account of race, what's actually useful about it is that he's not talking about hair texture, he's not talking about skin color, he's not talking about the shape of the skull or any of those supposed biological markers that become metonymic for race overwhelmingly. He's talking about politics. And from that you get race. You get who gets to be treated as members of the political community. And I think what is especially telling is that you had a room full of very elite, mostly white elected officials of this country whose lives were in danger from a movement that was being shaped by this understanding that the nation was somehow under siege of people who were not legitimate and who were not securing the right for rule. And so there's, I think, a lot to be said about what that implies. That should in no way diminish the role of anti-Black racism, of anti-Indigenous racism, of anti-Latinx racism that is part of this, and I'm sure we're going to get to the Christian nationalism that is part of this, that is especially animated by attacks on queer and trans peoples. That is very much a part of this idea that something has gone awry and that Trump was supposed to bring back. But I think that one of the things that we are contending with, and I'm stopping here, is the question of how we're going to move to a place where we're not in a situation of another type of, I'll say, racialization of political enemies that's happening because so many people are convinced that the legitimate government that we have is actually one that is illegitimate and that has somehow seized away from them control of their country. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Our next panelist is Christopher McKnight Nichols. He's an associate professor of history at Oregon State University, where he directs the Center for the Humanities and leads the Citizenship and Crisis Initiative. He specializes in the history of the United States and its relationship with the rest of the world, with a focus on isolationism, internationalism, and globalization. And for those of you who reside in Oregon, you're probably familiar with hearing Chris's voice a lot on the radio too. He does a lot of public scholarship.
Thanks so much, Amy. Thanks to everyone for coming out for this panel and for this discussion. I wish we could all be in person. That's my only lament right now. So what I thought I would do first is try to do two things in our short period of time. Sketch out, as I see it, some of the historical dimensions of this current moment of the divided states of America, of the inauguration, of the Capitol, the storming of the Capitol, and a little bit more broadly try to contextualize our moment, and then speak a little bit to the inaugural speech and try to situate that a bit in historical and political context, if possible. So first off, we're thinking about what this moment heralds and what some of the signature elements at work here that we should sort of just get at the table are. The new president, Joe Biden, is arguably the most experienced person stepping into the presidency in modern US history. He was first elected to the Senate in 1972, spent 30 years there, 6 terms. He was VP for 2 terms. He stepped out of office, as we know, thought long and hard about coming back in. And so, other candidates for that would be LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, but stepping in after the assassination of JFK, and in a very different moment. The rules of the Senate are much more complicated today. American governance is more complicated. Hyperpartisanship is an enormous issue that's in the background of everything we've just heard from Professors Gash and Johnson. And Biden is uniquely capable of dealing with that. You'd be hard pressed to find another politician today who has as much esteem across the aisle as Joe Biden. Now, that doesn't make it any easier for him, but it certainly doesn't make it as hard as it would be for virtually any other candidate. That's a pretty important thing to think about in this moment. And that's partly a product of his personal tragedies, of his faith, and of things that will serve him well moving forward. Okay, the next up, one of the more significant things, of course, is Kamala Harris, right? Our first female VP, woman of color, first person of color in the vice presidency, a Southeast Asian. Talking about, Professor Johnson noted the world reaction to this. India was excited about this election, not just because Joe Biden replaced Donald Trump, but because they had one of their own, someone with even more direct ties, arguably, than Barack Obama had to Kenya. The direct ties between Harris and India and Madras are strong. So if you look at the global reactions to this moment, the historic nature of this, that's a piece of it too. Sort of the personnel is policy is this old cliche, and that's a piece of this administration. So the cabinet folks who are nominated so far are the most diverse in modern US political history. You've got more women, more people of color, more different sexual orientations. By virtually any metric you can throw out there, this is likely to be the most diverse, most representative, therefore, of the American population. But this gets at what we were just talking about in both of the previous comments, right? This is precisely what this you might call reactionary insurgency has been all about. Demographic change in the US, extremist violence, voter suppression. What my next two colleagues will talk about undoubtedly will factor into that. So these are some of the historical dimensions of our moment. They're a good historian's answer to how unprecedented is it that the Capitol was stormed on January 6th is that it's mostly unprecedented, but there have been some of these kinds of attacks in the past, right? So if you've been following this, you all know the War of 1812 and 1814, the British burned the Capitol. The Capitol, by contemporary observers then, people would say is the only building worth burning, although they also burned the White House and a bunch of other places. Fast forwarding a bit, one of the more interesting things is that the populist Andrew Jackson invited a whole mob to the White House, and they pretty much wrecked the place in 1829. That's another kind of a storming by domestic folks. There are virtually no other incidents of domestic insurgents in the Capitol, with the other exception being 1954, when Puerto Rican nationalists shot up the Capitol, injuring about 5 policymakers. But you never had the iconic images that we saw in the past few weeks. This is why even, Mitch McConnell has suggested he's open to impeachment of Donald Trump, because lawmakers cowering in the pews of the Capitol, people with weapons out, deaths, destruction, all the sorts of images that we've seen. This is something that is frankly unprecedented in U.S. history. I imagine all my colleagues will be teaching versions of this sometime in the future, and probably for the rest of our lives. So those are some of them. Another important issue, of course, is the epical, once in 100 years pandemic, right? We've now crossed the threshold of 400,000 deaths. Joe Biden keeps talking about how this is more than the US war casualties in World War II, but it's also more than all battle casualties in World War I and World War II. And we could pick lots of other ways to benchmark how horrific this has been. And you saw some of this in the language that he used in the inauguration. So I'll quickly pivot to that. One of the things that we saw in the inauguration was this call for unity. It didn't surprise any of us as philosophers, as religious historians, as political scientists, as historians. But calls for unity are kind of double-edged swords. So if you go back through the history of presidencies, one thing that's interesting that stood out to me was he chose 1863, mentioned that in the inauguration yesterday, chose Lincoln, talking about putting his whole soul into the Emancipation Proclamation. But he didn't go to, say, the Gettysburg Address. He didn't, which has been another popular move for Joe Biden in the past, to go to that, to go to the, nor did he go to one of his other sort of standard moves, which has been to turn to the Lincoln second inaugural in 1865, which has the famous lines, "With malice towards none, with charity for all." Right. And so as what my two colleagues have just noted, this unity call suggests that you can move beyond extremism, that move beyond voter suppression, can move beyond the big lie, beyond the second ever impeachment of a president, and perhaps rapidly. The jury's still out on that, but that kind of a call makes us wonder, should give us pause about questions of accountability. And if you look back through world history, if you look back through US history, one other example to bring up, it may be obvious to the smart folks who are out here, is the failures of Reconstruction in the US. Calls for unity, simple ways of papering over real differences. And this is a point that Biden made yesterday, that these are times of testing, he said, that there are these cascading crises and challenges today. Sure, that there are these problems, he suggested, and yet he didn't operationalize a path forward. And that Reconstruction, thinking about unity over the rights of minority groups, rights over newly freed slaves, that's a problem. Because the current challenges that the US faces, and back to that first point, the unprecedented nature of a second impeachment of a president who lied about electoral fraud. Lots of incumbent presidents have lost in US history. None has ever contested an election and never conceded. And papering over that suggests a real problem in what a call for unity might entail, because it couldn't actually bring people together without some, say, truth and reconciliation commissions, or impeachment alone won't solve these problems. In fact, it's probably the tip of the iceberg. I'd love to talk more about this, and I hope we can in our Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Joseph Orozco. He's professor of philosophy at Oregon State University and director of the Peace Studies Program and co-founder of the Inaris Project for Alternative Futures. Dr. Orozco's primary area of interest is in social justice and political philosophy, particularly democratic theory and global justice.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you to everyone who's here today. I'm very honored to be here amongst my esteemed colleagues as the philosopher. I think of John Dewey when I think of situations like this. He thought that the role of the philosopher is found somewhere between the historian and the poet. The job of the historian is to help make sense of the past. Dewey thought the role of sociologists, political scientists is to help us understand the present. The job of the poet or the artist is to use imagination to help sketch forward an image of the world as it might be. And for Dewey, the role of the philosopher, he said, is to use logic to help us to connect the past and the present, and to use logic and reasoning to build a bridge to the future. So I hope I can talk about past, present, and future in this way. These moments of past, present, future were really brought together for me recently when I was reading a news article in the Oregonian about the pro-Trump rally at the Oregon Capitol in Salem on January 6th. The Valley Antifa network had identified a man at the rally who had gotten into a fistfight with counter-protesters, and his name was Kyle Brewster. In 1988, Kyle Brewster and two of his friends used a baseball bat to beat to death an Ethiopian immigrant named Mulugeta Sarah in Southeast Portland. At the time, I was a first-year student at Reed College, and this murder happened just a little ways away from where I was living in the dorms. I was new to Oregon, and I really loved how Oregon was. It was so different from where I'd grown up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. But learning about the murder of this Black man by racist skinheads really changed my experience of this place. I remember being able to find white Aryan resistance stickers. This was the organization that Kyle Brewster had belonged to. I remember finding these on light poles in Southeast and downtown Portland. And I came to realize that there was a whole underground of violent white supremacists lurking throughout the area. I remember learning to have to watch over my shoulder when I went out at night anytime I left the bubble of my college home. So I remembered those feelings of fear and of anger. I was angry when I saw Kyle Brewer again in the news, talking about how he was proud to have just beaten some Antifa BLM during the protest, and that he would do so again if he had the chance. I realized that this was one of those moments when people talk about history repeating itself. Moments when you see old habits of being, ways of life, patterns of force that go way back in time, materializing themselves again in the actions of people right in front of you. I felt angry, and I'll talk more about that. In this case, when I'm talking about habits of action and thought, I'm thinking about those within the traditional white supremacy in this country. There's a whole lineage of these patterns that goes from Kyle Brewster to the rest of his brethren that stormed the Capitol building in DC. And these are connected to the white mobs that burned down thousands of homes of their Black neighbors in East St. Louis in 1917, and Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, Omaha, Nebraska in 1919. And these extend to the coup that took place in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, when white supremacists overthrew an elected government of white and Black politicians by force, stripped civil rights from Black citizens, and they faced no consequences whatsoever afterwards. And all of this goes back to even earlier insurrection in 1676, when Virginia settlers rebelled against the colonial government because it refused to provide militia forces to displace Native Americans from their lands. This has come known as Bacon's Rebellion. The result of this were the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705 that divided and conquered this group of rebels by giving immunity from civil penalties to the non-Black members and essentially telling them that white identity is a commodity that's more valuable than most material possessions. Poor white farmers heard that message, and that finding cause with poor Blacks is never going to pay off anywhere near as well as it could be. And so they should always align themselves with rich landowners, because whiteness is always going to pay off. And since then, when large groups of white people feel that market conditions are changing and their whiteness no longer has cachet like it once did, they will respond with violence against those who they feel are devaluing their currency. And hence Wilmington, East St. Louis, Chicago, Tulsa, Omaha. Now the present. Political scientist Hakeem Jefferson of Stanford maintains that the riot in DC on January 6th was the next mode in this historical continuity. The research says that the best way to understand the riot is about the worry over the erosion of white dominance in the US. Social psychologists Maureen Craig and Jennifer Richardson have done studies and show that when white people are reminded of the changing demographics in this country, they tend to display more negative racial attitudes towards non-white people, and they show more affiliation with the Republican Party. Ashley Jardina has shown us that when white people hear about changing demographics, their white identity becomes much more salient to them as a cornerstone of their identity. But why would people who are feeling their status slipping in society suddenly attack the institutions of their own government? Political scientist Larry Bartell suggests that those whites who do feel that now feel that their government no longer serves their interests, but those of a multiracial coalition that put Biden into power. And all of these messages were dog whistled in the final days of the Trump administration with the release of the 1776 Commission report that said that the civil rights movement and identity politics is one of the greatest dangers to American principles online with slavery, fascism, and communism. His departing tweet to America by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was warning about the new woke administration that's going to talk about multiculturalism and that these ideas are simply not what America is about. But none of this talk and none of these developments should surprise us. This kind of white nationalism has been growing in boldness and audacity in the last few years, and the signs that it could boil over into a violent attack at the national level have been there for anyone who wanted to see it. National officials certainly knew it. In 2006, the FBI warned of a strategic infiltration of law enforcement agencies throughout the United States by white supremacist gangs. And a leaked report by the Office of Homeland Security in September 2020 called white supremacy the biggest threat to national security. The journalists and the activists who track white supremacists certainly knew about this activity. ProPublica reported that the Stop the Steal protests had been organizing online since December 23rd through social media. And indeed, the message board 8kun could spouted all these conversations about the insurrection, and the debate was how violent it should be amongst the participants. Investigative reporter Marva Hivelsdal has wrote a report recently for The Intercept this month, and she noted that the Stop the Steal protest that was part of the riot on January 6th had built an enormous online presence by building on the network created by the opening protests, the anti-lockdown groups. She noted that of the 3 million members of anti-lockdown and reopening groups on Facebook, about 40,000 of them joined Stop the Steal on Facebook. So there was an enormous sort of social media presence already going on that connects the anti-lockdown groups to the riot that took place on January 6th. And the anti-lockdown groups have been growing more violent over the past year. In Michigan, of course, there was the plan to kidnap and execute the governor, Gretchen Whitmer. In Colorado, in May 2020, anti-lockdown protesters were arrested with pipe bombs. In June of 2020, in Nevada, protesters were arrested for conspiring to blow up the federal buildings. And then here, this ties back to the Malheur takeover in Oregon, Ammon Bundy. In 2016, Ammon Bundy and his group of people took over the National Malheur Reserve in Eastern Oregon, faced no consequences afterwards for doing so. But in April 2020, he formed a group called People's Rights to defy the lockdown directives. In August 2020, they stormed and took over the Idaho Capitol building. People's Rights now has 16 chapters nationwide. So all of this is going on, but what's really interesting is that most law enforcement really wasn't that concerned. In June of 2020, the hacker group Anonymous did a massive hack that they call Blue Leaks of hundreds of police databases from around the countries. And what they found was that most police were concerned mostly with surveilling Black Lives Matter protests and not the reopening protests or those groups, despite the fact that BLM protesters were more often than not victims of the violence that was going on in places in Philly, in Portland, in Olympia, Washington, DC, and so forth. And so the present is grim. And it looks even worse when you tie it to the historical continuity. So the question is, how do we move forward in a way that doesn't consume us in fire and brimstone and civil war? And what's really interesting about this is that in thinking about moving forward, I was trying to analyze President Biden's speech. He tries to sketch a way forward. He called on all of us to work for unity against our common foes, anger, resentment, hatred. And he reminded us to think like the Christian philosopher, St. Augustine, who tells us that unity comes from focusing on the common objects that we love. And as Americans, Biden said, we love opportunity, security, liberty, dignity, respect, honor, and truth. And what I found really curious about this list is that nowhere in it did Biden ever mention justice. Justice is actually sparsely mentioned in the speech, and even less so as an idea of bringing people to justice. But perhaps the talk of justice and bringing people to justice is too divisive and judgmental. He does tell us that anger is a mood that we need to struggle against rather than embrace or wallow. But I want to end by suggesting that the emotion we might need at this present moment right now is actually anger. The peace scholar Barbara Deming wrote about 50 years ago that anger is a necessary emotion if there is to be change, she wrote. And she wanted to distinguish between a healthy anger and an unhealthy anger. An anger that she says, which is an affliction, and anger that is a determination to bring about change. And her thoughts were occasioned by talking with different social movement activists, feminists, and people in the civil rights movement who told her that they were angry about all the oppression and suffering. And she told them, well, look, nonviolence teaches us that we have to put aside anger and think about love. And many of them told her, you are violating us by talking this way. We feel that you're betraying. You're not our sister any longer. And so she was taken aback by this. So she started to think maybe anger is important. Unhealthy anger, she says this message: your very existence is a threat to my existence. A healthy anger, however, is the one that she wanted to cultivate. And that says, you are dangerous. You must change. And you can change. And I can change too, because I will no longer allow you to harm me. An unhealthy anger says, you can't change and I can't change if you are still here. So drop dead. But a healthy anger says, look, change is possible for both of us. I will not let you forget that you need to change. And I must remind myself that I cannot continue to live without that change taking place. In other words, the language of healthy anger is the language of accountability. And this has been at the forefront of the Black Lives Matter movement in the last year, the largest social movement in the last 60 years and perhaps in the country of the world, calling us to account for allowing police brutality not to linger year after year. And there are a lot of scholars working in this area, which is called Transitional Justice. And this is different than reconciliation or forgiveness, but about trying to account for historical wrongs. And so I say, I think we need to move forward. We need to fortify our social movements with healthy anger, that is determination to change, and not give in to calls for shallow reconciliation, recognizing the deep truth in the quote by James Baldwin. We can disagree and still love each other, unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and the denial of my humanity and my right to exist. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our last panelist, certainly last but not least, is Christopher Stout. He's an associate professor in political science at Oregon State University. Dr. Stout's research interests include racial and ethnic politics, gender and politics, political behavior, representation, and Congress.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you everyone for being here tonight, and thank my colleagues on this panel for their very informative lecture. I learned a lot and I appreciate a lot of what was said. I'm going to talk a little bit today. First, also apologize for using a PowerPoint. It's kind of a crutch for me. I'm going to talk about polarization in the United States and how that intersects or interacts with misinformation to lead higher levels of political violence, and what social scientists say we can do to address political polarization. So it's not surprising to anyone that polarization is getting much worse in the society, and there's thousands of ways to show this graphically. I chose one from the Pew Research Center, which showed that we as Americans start to view the other side as being much more unfavorably, right? We dislike the other side, and this is more true of some than others. And that's fine, right? In America, people can disagree about things. They can have different ideological perspectives, but it becomes problematic when it becomes dangerous, when we start to see the other side as being a threat to us and a threat to the nation. And there's numerous reasons about why this occurs. My colleagues before me have mentioned that particularly for Republicans in the United States, a lot of this comes with the threat of demographic change. As the country becomes more diverse, many Republicans, and particularly white Republicans, view the country as being different from what they want it to be, and they become more likely to view the other side as being problematic. But as that is happening even amongst Republicans, Democrats too largely see the other side as being a threat to the nation's well-being. And this is not a great starting point for any type of reconciliation or any type of compromise. And this gets worse the more politically extreme you are. If you look at these graphs at the bottom, people who are consistently liberal in their ideology see Republicans as threats to the nation, and 2/3 of Republicans who are conservative or consistently conservative in terms of ideology see Republicans as a threat to the nation. That threat to the nation often leads to a dehumanization of the other side, which then makes political violence much more acceptable. And so there's two scholars, Nathan Calmo and Liliana Mason, who have done a lot of research on looking at what this means if we start to dehumanize the other side in terms of our acceptance of violence. And they've shown that over the last 4 years, there's been a significant increase in people being okay with hurting others or harming others in some way, either physically or emotionally. And here's two graphs from some of their research, which asks the percent of people who agree, is it okay to send threatening messages to opposing leaders? Almost a quarter of Republicans agree with that statement, and more than 17% of Democrats agree with that statement as well. And even more extreme, is it okay to harm or harass the other side and make them feel unsafe? Then over 1 in 20 Republicans agree with that statement, and about 2% of Democrats agree with that statement. So to start, it's this polarization is getting worse, and it's increasing acceptance of violence toward others. And this becomes even worse when people feel cheated. So if you feel like the other side is in a position of power that they are undeserving, then you're much more likely to accept violence. And so this is a poll done by Brightline Watch right before the 2020 presidential election. And they asked people, if your side ends up losing, would you be okay with some type of violence against the other side? And Trump approvers of Trump approval, people who approve of Trump, depending on how strong you approve of them, 23% agree that it's okay for some type of violence happen to the other side. And overall, over 20% of Americans answering this poll agreed with the idea that it's okay to commit violence against the other side. Obviously, this is extremely problematic. But why? Why would they think violence is okay? So there's been a lot of research coming out over the last couple of weeks looking at the January 6th insurrection. And most people think it's okay because they feel like they feel a sense of victimhood, that they're being cheated, that they're being wronged. And it's the only way to right that wrong. And a lot of this idea comes from the big lie, as my colleagues have pointed out, that the election was fixed, or that Joe Biden didn't win the election because of some type of fraud occurring. And again, to make matters worse, this perception or this description of fraud is often racialized by saying it's happening in urban areas. So when Giuliani talks about fraud, he says it's happening in Philadelphia, in Milwaukee, and Chicago, places which are majority Black, which increases this sense of victimhood amongst some. And so this graph here basically shows you think that the election was legitimate. If you see green, that means that people say, yes, the election was legitimate. If you see red, more people see that it's illegitimate. What's interesting about this graph is it looks not just at likely voters, strong Republicans, a vast majority think that the election wasn't legitimate. But if you look at political elites and public servants, public officials, a significant minority of strong Republican elected officials said that the election was rigged or fixed. And this is why 147 Republicans in the US House voted to overturn the Electoral College votes in several states, and even 8 Republicans in the US Senate voted along. So polarization leads to threat. That increases this sense of misinformation. This misinformation increases the sense of victimhood. So the dehumanization of the other side, with the idea that the other side is screwing you over unfairly, it's not surprising then that we had the insurrection that we did on January 6th. So I'm interested, and I've increasingly become interested in how can we fix this problem, right? How do we get past this? So nations in which this type of stuff occurs can't stand. And so we know, as I put forth, polarization times misinformation increases political violence. And one of the growing problems in this area has been social media, and a lot of these, of sites that are unchecked by moderators. And you can see over time they become more and more extreme. So 4chan becomes 8chan, becomes 8kun, and as soon as moderation comes, a new site pops up to be more and more extreme. So platforms which put this out, Google, Apple, etc., and we've already seen this happen in the wake of the insurrection on January 6th, have to be much more willing to take stands against these types of websites. In terms of social media has to be willing to cut off people who are chronic offenders of spreading misinformation. And so one of their responses to 2016 was to put labels on whether or not information is correct or not. But after January 6th, they cut off some of the most chronic offenders, including the former president, Donald Trump himself. And within a week, misinformation decreased by 73%. And so with social media, large tech corporations taking more proactive stances can stop the spread of misinformation, which then makes polarization a much less potent force. What can we do in terms of the public? So there's a lot of work that shows there's ways to make things, to improve political polarization. One of those is just knowing someone of a different political party. People who know people of a different political party are less likely to dehumanize them, and are more likely to take less extreme positions and support political violence against the other side, because they can often not empathize, but at least understand that the other side is a human, and that it goes too far to advocate for any type of political violence. The other thing is be aware of partisan prejudice. There's a lot of fantastic work in racial and ethnic politics, particularly in racial and ethnic psychology, which shows that if you make people aware of racism, then they're much more likely to check their subconscious when making decisions. And the same thing appears to translate in terms of partisan prejudice, letting people know that, partisan prejudice is a real thing, and how you treat others, how you interact with others, even initially based off their partisanship, can be problematic, leads people then to change. And then finally, call out bad behavior and misinformation. If you see that bad behavior, you see misinformation online, I know it's hard to be confrontational, but it's important to be confrontational if there is to be any improvement. And then finally, can we fix this problem? We have to demand more from our political actors, right? There's a lot of research that shows we follow our elected officials in terms of their rhetoric. So if politicians use more negative rhetoric, then we're more likely to view the other side as being more and more of a problem. And so if there's more pushback for politicians that use negative rhetoric, then this should decrease this problem a little bit. It's not surprising that the polarization was exacerbated during the Trump years, and that acceptance of political violence during that period of time also grew during the Trump years, because Trump was a president who unabashedly said, I only care about my base. I'm not a president for all of America. I'm a president for my base of people, and everyone else is an enemy of the state. So it's not surprising then that his followers would think, yeah, others are the enemy of the state. And so there needs to be more pressure on politicians to do more. I'll close with maybe a more optimistic view of Biden's speech, his inauguration speech yesterday. And it's something I thought a little bit about, was that it did seem refreshingly different than Donald Trump's years of a base-only strategy. Bipartisanship was one of the major themes of the speech. And I think that that's something, that rhetoric, whether or not it actually is going to fix any problem, it's all mostly rhetoric. Who knows? But I do think that people, particularly Democrats, will think differently of it. And so having politicians speak more warmly about the other side, I think is a step in the right direction. So I'll stop here.
Thank you all so much for all of these insights. And I've been reading the questions in the chat, and I'm noticing a familiar trend in them, which is, how do we fix it? I think people are tired of, like, all this analysis is so helpful, but also everyone wants concrete things to do. So before we move into that fixing, I wonder if you have any questions or clarifications that you wanted to ask each other. And I wanted to lead off with one for Professor Stout, because I was really struck by the chart that showed the level of belief among political operatives in the Republican Party that the election was not fair. And I guess I'd been hearing a narrative in the media that people like Hawley and Cruz were basically political opportunists. They knew better. They knew that it was a fair election, and they were lying. Your chart suggests that there actually is this sense, it's not political opportunistic lying. There actually is this misperception. Is that true?
It speaks to their specific motives, but I do feel like it was mostly opportunistic. I'm kind of curious to know what my colleagues think. Some probably do believe it, right? So Marjorie Taylor Greene in Georgia is probably someone who thinks that this is actually happening. But I think most, like Howley, from what I understand, that he kind of knew the situation and he was mostly fundraising off of it, right? And you can see probably belief by how much of it was just a fundraising ploy, how much of it is, things that they're just saying. So I'm not sure that as many people fundraised off it the way that Cruz and Howley did. And then some don't have presidential aspirations who believe in it. And so the fact that some would speak about it who don't have presidential aspirations, who weren't fundraising off it, I'm sure some believed it. And some, I think, was probably just more opportunistic.
Right. Does anyone else have questions for each other before we open up into the larger chat? No? Oh, okay. Well, then get ready to fix it. So the first question that I see, it says, thank you for your generous time tonight. We've heard a lot of lofty rhetoric in recent days about coming together and uniting as a country. However, time and time again, we've seen that rhetoric only goes so far. What concrete actions can you suggest that individuals can pursue to create meaningful healing and social progress in this day and age? And I know that Professor Orozco and Professor Stout, you've offered some, but what else would you all like to contribute to that thought about beginning to fix this partisan fracturing? Yeah, please, Professor Gash.
This is something that I talk about with my students quite a bit. And, part of the response that I often give is that we really need to look locally for that unity, that there's a temptation really to look to national government. And, obviously there's been a lot of attention paid to national government because we've got this boogeyman in Trump, right? We have this great evil bad guy that we've all been able to rally against. And so a lot of the hope has just been, let's get him out and then we can sort of fix the problem. But, the reality is that so much of these rifts and so much of the anger isn't just between these two national parties, but really is both a function of and really is inspiring anger at the local level. And so the more that we can look to local community building, local politics, local public service as a space for creating those opportunities for unity, opportunities for cooperation, for collaboration, for mending fences, for forgiveness, and also, right, as Joseph Orozco talked about, right, opportunities for making our claims of anger, right, filing our grievances and letting people know, how we feel about certain conditions that are continuing to plague our communities. I think that's a really great place to look, because I think if we continue to look for national fixes, right, I think we're going to continue to be upset and we're going to continue to miss a lot of what this conflict is all about, which I think is often of a local nature.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to echo those sentiments as well. I think the attention toward justice, as Professor Orozco has emphasized, is critical. I think it's important for us to think about the contrast in the way the U.S. Responded to the attacks of 9/11 and the terrorism that is portrayed as the work of Al-Qaeda as a great threat to national security. We don't hear any calls for unity. We don't hear any talk about forgiveness. We don't hear anything about how we all need to come together and look over our differences. It's all about militarizing and bombing, and we're going to go after our enemies and that kind of talk. And the moves of sympathy and the calls for understanding white grievance that has characterized the response to the domestic terrorist acts by white terrorists for a long time has actually been in stark contrast to that. And even the ongoing discourses of comparing the insurrection to Black Lives Matter in ways that says, well, we didn't hear enough condemnation of violence happening with BLM. Why are people so angry with this mob that went into the Capitol building? Even though that's a false equivalence. There was relatively little violence that was happening among Black Lives Matter activists. Most of the violence was actually coming from the police who were attacking them, or from these state actors who were literally abducting them, who were kidnapping activists from the street. And it's important to recognize these Black Lives BLM activists were mostly people of color, but there are also many whites who were part of this. This was a multiracial movement. And it's important to attend to the race and ethnicity of the actors, but it's also important to understand the politics of the cause. So this was an anti-racist movement that met with incredible violence. And so the point of this is that we do have to emphasize justice. I think we do have to, I'm not implying that we should say, let's go out and kill our enemies and take the anti-9/11 rhetoric and apply that to what we have now, so we have more militarism. But I do think that this idea of equivalence is very misleading. And the reality is that I think Professor Orozco's point is right. If you're going to have justice, you're not going to please everybody. They're actually, it's not as if the fundamental problem is that people just don't understand that they're trying to take rights away from other people. And if we can just explain it clearly, everybody will nod and assent and say, oh, okay, we get it. Now let's all just live together. This is rooted in interest of power. And there are people who are committed to sharing power, and there are people who aren't, who are deeply opposed to sharing power. And they actually understand that they don't want to share power. They're not suffering from a lack of understanding. So we do need concerted efforts to condemn that violence. We do need to stop trying to placate everybody and saying, look, we and this was the point, you put this beautifully with that quote by James Baldwin at the end. You know, I can tolerate a lot of things, but I just can't tolerate your wanting to exterminate me and saying that there's no place for me in this society. We can't tolerate that. So if we have that, if we stop honoring the white supremacists who did not represent those things, and let's build some statues to people who have fought for justice and who have been willing to take up arms to fight for justice, instead of only glorifying the people who take up arms to kill indigenous people or to maintain racist societies. And we have the change in the symbols and the narratives, and we actually call for some accountability in the way that our curricula prepare our students to understand history, instead of shielding them from so-called ethnic studies, that as Arizona did, for example, outlawing ethnic studies K through 12, then we can get further along this road of getting more people on board, while also understanding that if we're waiting for everyone to agree, we're never going to have justice.
I'd love to tack onto that as well. So, you know, one of the reasons that I was pointing out Reconstruction, and I think Professor Johnson hit it perfectly there in thinking about curricular changes, we all need to have a curriculum. Like, we all need to be self-educating. And one of the really, you know, if you think back historically, and getting a richer, more difficult kind of history is hard for many Americans, it's hard for people in lots of societies. If we take that on board, it means owning all of our complicity in all kinds of systems, for one, and understanding that past. But for two, you know, this sort of, Professor Orozco, again, we're all complimenting you because, you know, you hinted at a lot of these themes here, right? You know, the civil rights movement, it should be no surprise that at the very end of the Trump administration, they issued the 1776 report. They tried to create a garden of heroes. Their kind of optimistic, false white supremacist history is precisely the problem. And the actual history of countering that is one of difficulty and hardship and righteous anger and suffering on all sides. And part of the victories, you know, one of the reasons why we should be wary of the facile language of unity is that, you know, the end of Reconstruction is about a moment where the federal government could have imposed more power, used its power and imposed that power to protect the due process rights, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment rights of individuals living in those states. Instead, they chose the Faustian bargain of a little bit more Republican power, a little less Democratic power. And at the end, we're still living with the long tail of those injustices. They're very present in our society today. But if you think back to other moments, right, the civil rights movement is not full of a perfect, non-violent, you know, glory. This, even we were just celebrating Martin Luther King Day, right? You know, King had lots of difficult views. I don't need to tell you, and perhaps Professor Orozco, you can help sum this point up. But letters from the Birmingham jail are from jail, right? Civil disturbance is crime. The point is not to generate crime. The point is not violence, as Professor Johnson said. The point is to awaken people to the injustice in society, as Professor Gash was saying, to then take meaningful action, right? To change things. And it won't be easy. It's not simple. We can't just have nonviolent folks and then suddenly poof, change, right? That's not how this stuff works. It hasn't happened historically. I'd love it if it did tomorrow, but that doesn't seem likely, especially after the assault on the Capitol, which seems to me to be emblematic of how frankly fractured the US is, and that we've seen this especially with COVID, the fractures and crises in society, right? That marginalized people and poorer people are suffering disproportionately. This is a fundamentally unjust society, and fixing that isn't simple. There are no good fixes. The fairness doctrine, getting rid of social media, there are lots of moves we can make, but there's no silver bullet for this.
Well, one of the other comments that came in, I think, tails onto this is a question about the fact that how are we going to heal a social divide when people are dealing with different sets of facts? So maybe we can attack that straight on and think about what are some of the ways that misinformation is playing into this kind of partisanship and increasing violence? And is there anything that can be done about that? And I'm mindful of the first press briefing yesterday by the Biden administration, the emphasis that was placed over and over again by the new press secretary on facts, on transparency. So there's a change in tone, but I am also aware, we're all aware of people are now getting very specialized news sources that have very different senses of what's a fact and what's a not. So what's to be done, or where are we?
Yeah, I think this is, I guess I'll take a crack at this, but I don't know that there's anything that can be done, right? Like, I don't know, as Chris pointed out, there's just no silver bullet for this. The fact that people see the same thing and come to vastly or widely different conclusions is problematic. And I don't know how that can be fixed. Especially because I think people are much better at reasoning now or at least thinking about reasons for why things are fake, right? And so I think once Trump injected this idea of fake news and that there's a difference in reality, I think people can look at anything, even concrete evidence. You can say the sky is blue, and if someone tells you the sky is not blue, you can think, oh, that it's a larger conspiracy. I think that's the heart of all of this, right? Like, there's no way for reconciliation to occur unless we can at least agree on something as being tangible, something as being real. And that's something that I'm grappling with and thinking a lot about. Like, how do we get people to how can we get people to be on the same page with something? And I think social media has just exacerbated that problem. And so, yeah, I have no idea of how to fix it.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to sort of think through this, in my own teaching. Shortly after Trump came into power, I actually created a class called Facts and Politics, where I basically every day was just me debunking these sort of moments of misinformation and as somebody pointed out, pure lies that were being spread by various individuals. But what we have to remember is that the misinformation and the belief in things that are patently untrue is in service of propping up our own biases, right? So it's not as if these are two separate conversations, right? Where we've got this deep rooted, enduring problem around racism and perceptions of white supremacy, and then we also have this sort of tangential, but parallel problem of misinformation, right? The misinformation and the lying and the creating of these echo chambers of victimization, right, of victimhood around whiteness is all part, right? This is all in service of, right, propping up these perceptions around white supremacy and creating a space for increased radicalization, really. And so, like, when you're talking about misinformation, that's doing a job, right? It's not a byproduct of something. It's an actual, there's intentionality to it, because this is what needs to be done, right? This is how people who are hoping to continue to, contain or continue to expand these legacies of white supremacy are trying to get more people to buy into it, right? Is by, right, sort of recreating the landscape of information in ways that prop up this and create a need for these sort of white supremacist values. So, I don't, it's because of that, because it's actually being done in order to scaffold, right, exactly the sorts of white supremacist, white nationalists, deeply racist problems that we've had since, the founding of our country. It's a really hard problem to disentangle, right? I mean, like, part of me would like to say, well, we just have to educate people more, right? And that's sort of part of it, but we have to educate people more, but we also have to account for, right, the sort of insidiousness of white supremacy and the insidiousness of anti-Black racism in the context of the kinds of misinformation that are being propagated. So, it's really tough, which doesn't answer the question at all. It just, suggests that it's a really, really, really big problem.
I have one suggestion, and part of it is that I didn't talk about truth, which is a weird thing for a philosopher not to do. I talked instead about emotions, because I think that there's a lot of really interesting stuff that's coming out of like cognitive neuroscience and folks like George Lakoff and stuff like this. That, look, the problem is, I mean, there's sort of a kind of a, perhaps a kind of a bias that we all have, that if we just educate enough and give people facts, that they have to be bound to change their minds. And right, there's a lot of neuroscience stuff that's out there that suggests that this is just not how people think. People do not think in terms of syllogisms, premises, and then conclusion. They think through lenses that sift through data, and they will acknowledge some things as true and other things as not. And thinking and coming to beliefs is very complicated, and a lot of this is emotional rather than cognitive. So given that kind of thing, I think that a place to begin is not necessarily, I mean, misinformation and lies and all that obviously is a component of this, but I think we also need to realize that the white supremacy and white supremacy itself in this country is rooted in fear. Bacon's Rebellion was about fear. And then the creation of white identity was about the fear of rich landowners worried that all these peasant masses were going to take away things from them. And so always from the very beginnings of white supremacy and its understanding in this continent has been about loss of status, loss of life, and fear. And we live in a deeply fearful society because we live in a deeply insecure society. And part of this has to do with economic changes that have taken place in the last 40 years that have eroded wages, have eroded the ability of people to take care of themselves. We don't have decent health care in the middle of a global pandemic, right? In the past year, right? Today was the first day that it was noted, right, that the first case of COVID-19 in the United States. And now we have 40,000 people who have died as a result of a bunch of botched programs, but just we don't have the infrastructure to take care of one another. And so I know that there's some folks like Zach Norris has written a book called Defund Fear. We need to figure out how to build a culture of caring. And I know I talked about anger, and I think that righteous anger is important, but we should have righteous anger as determination to shore up communities so that we can take care of ourselves and take care of one another and build real security that's not built around having armed police everywhere, because it's very clear that police presence everywhere is not helping us to feel safer and more secure, as Professor Johnson was pointing out, right? More violence has been inflicted as a result of the agents of supposed security. So the question is, how do we do that? And I think that social movements is the answer. It's always been the answer. The reason that we got rid of slavery was not because benevolent politicians decided, oh, this is going to be a good idea to do this. It's because they were forced by social movements to engage in an involuntary transformation of power. It's about power and who has it. The reason that we don't have children working in factories and dying is because of social movements forced corporate leaders to change their ways. The reason that women have a right to vote is because, not because men suddenly decided, we decided that we want to be ethical and true. It's because they were forced and coerced by social movements in nonviolent and sometimes not so nonviolent ways to change, and they didn't want to. there's a lot of people, as Professor Johnson was saying, don't want change to happen now. They are invested in creating cultures of insecurity and fear because they profit off of that. That's what we need to confront. We can confront that in our workplaces through unions that take care of the well-being of their constituents, our communities. When we talk about police violence in our own communities, there's a whole different kinds of ways of doing this locally. But I think it has to really do with these kinds of questions of how do we take away the bases of fear that lead to people being willing to trust QAnon and all these kinds of things that at least give them some kind of semblance of order in a world that is utterly frightening to them. And that's because of all these social, economic, and political policies that thrive on fear.
You're still muted.
Yesterday, Michael Beschloss was muted for like a full 3 minutes on TV, so I feel better about speaking muted. Does anyone else have other comments or thoughts they want to add before we move on to some of the other questions are a little bit more specific, and so maybe we can start to dive down from the general to the specific. So there's one that I think is mostly intended for Professor Gash, but it's about how to restore faith in the voting system.
I mean, it's a big question, because unfortunately, if you had asked me this question, even 2 months ago, I would have said, well, it's really just about, it's about fixing the systems, and it's about making sure that, there's unbiased and, clear standards in who gets to vote and what the mechanisms are for voting, and making sure that, we restore Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act so that, any of the sort of bad apples are held accountable, right? Are not able to sort of squeak through these really unconscionable mechanisms of voter disenfranchisement. But, when you have like crazy situations like a Republican legislature in Pennsylvania, right, banding together to support mail-in voting, and then 3 years later having Republicans in Pennsylvania talk about how mail-in voting is just a function of biased voting or voter fraud or enfranchising illegal votes or whatever sort of craziness was being articulated. It's so hard to inject rationality into a system that is being brought down by sort of toxic partisan rhetoric, right? So that the same public officials that created the system are saying that the system was created in ways that benefit the other party, even though they created the system, right? So like, I don't know how you build faith back in the system. I mean, certainly you have to, right? So certainly you have to attempt to uphold the goals of, greater enfranchisement. Certainly we have to make sure that people see that it's in everyone's interest for people to be able to vote, right? That this is not something that it's in one party's interest versus the other. It's in all of our interests to be able to vote, right? To be able to have access, to vote for individuals who reflect our own values or beliefs or our own, ambitions. And to make sure that there's transparency in the system, right? To make sure that there's a set of standards that all counties, all states are abiding by. And maybe it's about, federalizing some sort of national voting day so that, some of this craziness around, idiosyncratic state dates and whatnot disappears. And I think some of that would help. But man, we keep going back to Trump and Trumpism, doing a number on a lot of this, but the degree to which so many people truly fundamentally believe that mail-in voting of all things is the devil, right? Despite the fact that, people in the military have been using mail-in voting forever, right? Despite the fact that the very people who were demonizing mail-in voting were using mail-in voting to vote, right? So the fact that that mechanism has been so maligned, it means we just have a pretty far way to go in terms of installing some faith. But I believe truly that the right thing to do is really to address the actual problems that exist, right? I know that there's a desire to try to defend the system from these sort of allegations of voter fraud, but I think really we need to fix the actual problems, right? The noted, right, empirically validated, legitimized problems that we've had, for decades, for centuries in this country around voter disenfranchisement. That's the thing that we have to really focus on, right? And the other stuff is just part of the toxicity of partisan divisiveness in this country.
Anyone else want to also speak to that?
I have one thought, just sort of food for thought for the audience. I'm not usually an advocate of large federal power, but voting seems like a great place to put your thumb down on the scale and say, okay, we need a national holiday. We need to have uniform voting standards. We need to have, maybe call it a nonpartisan committee, call it a group of social scientists who do data analysis related to districting and gerrymandering, right? We are using a lot of our systems of elections, our outdated systems developed by people who couldn't possibly have understood the technologies, range, size, and capacity of the current state. Part of the reason that people feel disfranchised, part of the reason they feel that elections are rigged is they know about things like hanging chads over here. They're worried about Dominion voting machines over there. The state of Oregon has, we all vote by mail. It works beautifully. It's so easy. I haven't waited online in a long time. Then there's secondary effects, like, how much do I feel a part of the political process because I vote by mail? I'm at a distance. My political science colleagues can talk about this. So we can try to deal with those things. We should all have time off from work. Why is there this class structure for who votes? And we could go on and on. Felon disfranchisement varying by states, and then you could think about how representation is proportioned out. Why should California's voters be so diluted in their power versus very small state folks like in the Dakotas, for instance, right? So one way to get back there is to just say, hey, we all vote the same way. We all have very similar one man, one vote in the old sense is the literal current sense, right? And that everybody votes in very similar ways with very similar rights, and there's less variation across. So you can't point out to those Pennsylvania guys signing that, hey, maybe there was malfeasance in Georgia because it's Georgia. They don't know how to run an election. Or Oregonians are, all hippies and they vote by, they vote by mail. But in fact, there's a whole lot of Republicans who, in a bipartisan pushed for vote by mail years ago, right? They wanted it in this state. So, I think that's a really important piece to think about, that through federal legislation on some of these kinds of moves, we could really enfranchise a lot of voters and shore up at least some level of trust. There will always be some people who don't agree with that. You can think about that too with the Electoral College. Moving forward, it seems so clear that people want the president who got the most votes to be president. And they simply don't poll after poll suggests they don't understand and don't like the fact that it's possible. And recently has happened a number of times that hasn't been the result.
On to that quickly. I agree with everything that is said. I have a real pessimistic view about voting rights. So as Dr. Gash pointed out in the case Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, the Supreme Court told Congress go back and just rewrite what deserves preclearance. And when the voting rights passed in 2006, it got over 400 votes. But starting in 2000, this voter fraud narrative started by Hans von Spakovsky and the Heritage Foundation has just taken hold so much that now Democrats have both the House and the U.S. Senate. And when the Democrats took over the House in 2018, H.R. 1 was a bill on voting rights. That I'm hopeful that they could do something similar now, but I think Republicans now have an excuse to say, oh, I'm not voting for that because I worry about voter fraud. Whereas in 2006, not voting for the voting rights meant largely you're probably admitting to being racist, right? And so I think that the suggestions Professor Gash and Nichols brought out are clear. I think that's the only way that you could restore at least enough confidence in the system. But I'm pessimistic that anything like that could get done in the current political environment.
I like this balance of both, right, pragmatism and then a kind of realism about what is possible. So maybe we'll take that into the next question, which is also more specific. And I think it's to you, Professor Johnson, which is about, are there processes through which there can be better vetting or security clearance for members of the military so that we somehow begin to address the problem of white supremacist organization in the military and in police forces?
Sure. There are some, in theory, very straightforward ways to do this. The problem is really more political will, not the inability to detect. So I was just telling you about the Atlantic Monthly journalistic author who was pointing to the number of military and law enforcement personnel who are part of Oath Keepers and who are actually creating a threat to the security of our society by their participation in a white supremacist militia group. We have extraordinary capabilities to extract and analyze information about people all over the planet. We have things like the National Security Agency, we have the FBI, we have literally the most sophisticated capabilities to know what we want to know about anyone on the planet, and even people who are in the space station, off this planet. So we can certainly understand and find out which people who are in the military and law enforcement are actually participating in so-called extremist movements. The problem has been political. It's been the fact that, for example, in the 1960s, policing was transformed, and not quite for the first time, but in a very definitive way, to be militarized in order to decimate and destroy anti-racist movements. That's how we got SWAT, Special Weapons and Tactics. It was specifically designed to destroy, neutralize, and even kill people who were part of Black anti-racist movements, and then more broadly, and that became policing. And there was a deliberate effort to recruit people who had military service, because the emphasis was on introducing military weapons and military tactics. So that's what Special Weapons and Tactics, or SWAT, stands for, into the law enforcement personnel so that they could actually conduct warfare, literally, using military weapons and tactics against people who are actually trying to create multiracial democracy. And that political choice, the introduction of the FBI into administering policing and law enforcement activity, on top of the colonial racial history of Western militaries, so that includes the United States, but also European militaries, that had practiced warfare against non-white peoples in order to destroy their ability to maintain sovereign states and to be self-determining. That longer racial and colonial history then fed into the police departments. And then you add to that the narratives that the FBI began to produce and feed into law enforcement, that the enemies of the United States were peoples of color. In 1967, the FBI's official conclusion is that Black people were actually a greater threat to the United States than communism. and so that a threat to the internal security. So that's just a little bit of the historical framing about why the political will has not been there. It's because policing itself and militarism has been defined and executed through a racist political enterprise. And there are some important exceptions to that, but that's actually the structural and political history. That's just an honest accounting of it. It is. And if we can be honest about that, and if we can say, well, that's wrong, it's unacceptable, we're going to change it, and we're not going to base policing on racism, and we're not going to conduct warfare and use military tactics against domestic peoples. We're actually going to go back to a civilian philosophy of law enforcement as opposed to a military philosophy of law enforcement. Then you can create the structural conditions to begin to address this problem. But as long as the political project of policing is actually a racial project, even if you could identify extremists in law enforcement, if the political aim is still largely to hyper surveil and to incarcerate en masse Black and brown populations, and to create a system of rewarding people through employment, so that this becomes a way lots of people have jobs, and then you monetize that. So even if departments or municipalities want to change their policing, now you're hooked on the revenue stream that it creates. Until we do that, the looking for the extremists is sort of a tip of the iceberg. Yeah. So yes, we can do this. It's a clear path to how. There's no shortage of insightful analysis of mass incarceration and its connection to structures of racism and the history of the militarization. We have this information. We have lots of experts who understand this. Now we need to take that and turn it into truth-telling and political will to change it.
I think we're going to have to let that be the last word because we're at 7:30, but I want to again thank Professors Orozco and Nichols and Gash and Stout and Johnson for a really maybe not a happy conversation, but a necessary conversation. So thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who joined us tonight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.